state of things. Good. So welcome to this meetup from my part as well. The meetup is about maybe a bit untraditional, easy development methods. We'll talk in this case specifically about persisting a React.js application using the easy Platform JavaScript Client API. So that's obviously quite a bit of a mouthful, but I hope the end result is that you have more of an idea of how you could use maybe easy in the future, not only with traditional methods, but also possibly as part of JavaScript-driven mobile applications or other interesting things. So first of all, let's see if we can move forward. Yep. So first, a few words about myself. So I'm Jani Tarvainen. I worked for quite a few years doing all kind of different things, and this being mostly an easy meetup. I don't have the official slide deck from Easy, so I'm speaking mostly in my own voices about. So this is not any kind of easy official recommended approach. But for me, I've been working with Easy for quite a few years, since 2008 or so, and earlier this year in February I actually joined Easy, and I've been since February helping people work with Easy in various different ways. So officially I'm a professional services consultant, but maybe firefighter or something would be as fine as well. But I give trainings and give smart tips and sometimes not so smart tips and so on. I also do some other things during night, so I do a lot of things on Twitter. I'm Velmu. You can maybe then find on Twitter both the video and then the slides later on. But enough about me, because you didn't come here to talk or listen about me. So first of all, for a little background information, who is familiar with React? Who has worked with React? Okay, good. So it's basically a JavaScript user interface library that's been around only for a couple of years. So maybe since 2013 it was launched. I think the first project was from Facebook, but it wasn't Facebook, it was actually Instagram web version. Nowadays React is obviously used pretty much everywhere. It's used by Apple for JavaScript powered API documentation and some other CMS products, and who knows where it's used. It's very popular and pretty much all over the place, but at its core it's still just a user interface library, which essentially means that you need quite a lot of other things in addition to make comprehensive full applications with React, but that doesn't limit the usefulness or add or take anything away from that. And what you can essentially think about React as is a DOM abstraction. So the DOM is just the way the browser sees the content and the page structure that you build using HTML, and then usually you manipulate that using JavaScript libraries such as jQuery and so on. So you create maybe new nodes, remove them, change attributes and so on. Essentially React is just an abstraction of all that. So you don't specifically modify any DOM nodes manually. Instead you work with the React APIs, who then the virtual DOM was a big hype at one point, so it essentially does only the required modifications on the DOM API and so on. So first of all, obviously most people think that React as a JavaScript technology is a client-side technology, so it runs in the browser, which of course it does, and well, that's the power of it when you use React. But it's also worth noticing that any React component that you write in JavaScript, it can also be rendered on the server side. So, and this doesn't mean having anything like a headless browser in between, translating the result and creating the HTML. Instead, it just is able to run on the server side either with Node, or then you can actually use PHP as well. PHP has an embedded V8 JavaScript engine library, so you can run JavaScript in your PHP, which at first I actually thought it was insane, that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and maybe for a lot of things it doesn't. But for this specific case, having an embedded JavaScript engine in PHP can be very useful. And one other thing which React maybe started as a whole is kind of this hierarchical component structures for UIs, because traditionally front-end development maybe wasn't very structured, and it could easily become a big mess, or especially in bigger projects when you started up with a tree and then somebody added some modifications to it, like click a button. Sure, that works, but then over time usually JavaScript tends to become more of a read-only code, or kind of I dare not touch this because it really has no structure. So or it doesn't enforce any structure. So that's kind of the thing with many of the JavaScript issues, that the UIs can be a bit tricky to develop and maintain, not because the technology is bad, but because the technology does not limit you at all. Then that is just one thing, that the components and the tree-like structure is good to keep in mind. You should obviously learn more about React. There's plenty of more things to learn than you'll learn here today. Today will hopefully scratch the surface and give you an idea of how things work. But more you should then find out on the website. So this was the core essence of JavaScript. We'll handle it currently in this demo. To limit things, we'll only handle it as a view library, simply as a view library, and only on the client side. So we won't do any server-side rendering or anything like that, because we simply don't have the capacity for time for today. Then to the other main part of today. So the easy Platform JavaScript Client API, or REST Client API, or there's a few different namings for it, but the Client API is one of the maybe easiest to remember, and that's in the file name also. And this in turn is, if React is an abstraction of the DOM layer for making it interacting with it easier, then the CAPI or CAPI is an abstraction for the easy REST API. So the easy REST API version 2, which has been around for quite a few years, is actually one of the most complete, functionally complete libraries that CMSs have. You can do a lot of things. You can even modify the content structure and the content model using this. But the REST API itself, using raw HTTP queries and so on, can be quite laborsome to use, because you need to kind of read and know quite a bit to work with it. So on top of this, the client API helps you work with this API or the REST API without actually doing a single request yourself. You don't, when you work with a JavaScript API, you don't send a request to the REST API to create a page. You say to the REST or the client API that I want to create a page or content type. So it's an abstraction in the sense, and since I will take the liberty of assuming that you have easy expertise in the group or in the audience, we'll see some details how this actually translates into reality a bit further. And one notable thing is obviously that it is used by the Easy Platform UI core functionality. So all of the functionalities that we have underneath the the content section in the administration interface of Easy Platform is actually powered by the same API. So in this case, you're not actually using any kind of byproduct or anything like that. Each of these requests, when I see details, I get some of the information, I go to the edit. You're already, if you're using the new interface, you're using the client API each day. So when I save, this one actually uses the client API instead of having a custom built. Obviously, it does send the request, but the developer doesn't need to think about the request itself. So in this case, it's robust, it's in use, and it's not going away. It will evolve, but it's there to stay. And obviously, the end result is that instead of you maybe writing your own abstraction layer, you might be able to use the same abstraction layer as the product does. There's obviously nothing enforcing you to use the client API, but also it's something that can be of very high convenience, especially if you're versed already with the concept of working with the public PHP API in the backend. And obviously one thing that's always worth noting is that the server is always the gatekeeper, because you're running client-side code. You might run something that looks silly to like a developer, because you might say something, if logged in, then show save button or delete button. You might, since the client gets that code, they might be able to hack that and say, put the delete button there. But because all of the commands, they anyway end up going through the PHP API, you can't really, unless your content model or permissions model is fundamentally flawed, or you have everybody log in as admin, then they will be able to do things. But you should always just realize that the server is the one who is actually in control. The client API is simply a convenience layer on top of that. And maybe if we think about these two abstractions, so we have the DOM abstraction and then the API abstraction. So what would maybe be the kind of advantage of using these, or why would you want to use these and use them maybe together? Well, every kind of IT thing is essentially, even if you write from scratch PHP, which something people, it's funny that you write PHP from scratch. PHP already has quite a high tower, which it stands upon on like dependencies. So in this case, you just add a new abstraction layer, so you don't need to worry about how exactly what in the DOM will be changed with React, and also you don't need to worry about what kind of REST API calls are sent to the server when you use this one step higher abstractions. So both of these can be done obviously without these. They don't offer, I don't know, magical superpowers, but they just possibly make development more efficient and more enjoyable and less error prone, hopefully. So what you want to do is delegate the kind of heavy lifting and complexity to the libraries instead of doing them yourself, which is essentially what in PHP you have composer libraries for a lot of things. It's exactly the same thing. You don't want to do the same thing again and again. So this is kind of the idea for both of these libraries, and I guess pretty much for a whole lot of libraries in general. And one thing that is worth noting, in my opinion, which I just realized, that both Easy and React rely heavily on a tree structure. So obviously, if you work with Easy, you can go and pick up any Easy project pretty much and see the content tree and make assumptions of how it will work. React works in the same way. So you always have a root node in your application, and then that root node extends other nodes, and you can using the dev tools expand that tree and make assumptions based just on the tree, let's say, without even seeing the code, which is the same. And probably you could even create a React component that just bootstraps and expands the whole tree and so on. And it's worth noting that React as the client API are both just libraries, so they do one specific thing. They're not a complete framework. To do React applications, you will need routing. It doesn't have any routing facilities. You don't have any complex state management for your applications and so on. So this is why if you download some React boilerplate, there will be React, yes, but there will be at least 5 or 10 something additional libraries, which depending on the complexity might be hard to grasp. So in all, if you want to haven't tried React, I wouldn't jump straight into not even that like to do MVC application, because even that might somehow be made complex. So the danger with React is currently at least that it's easy to get frustrated because there's a lot to learn. So it's easier just to learn the basics and then bootstrap from there. And today's talk probably, hopefully, gives you the basic information and understanding of how you might work with the client API and React, but also with just the client API or just React. It kind of merges them in a simple application, which we'll see soon. So some of the possibilities that you could use this combination for, obviously building rich front-end applications. Your main logic, for example, is in the client browser. You do animations, and every once in a while save the things to the server and so on. Obviously, it gives you nice, smooth page transitions when you're not doing actual requests and so on. One very interesting opportunity is because Node, only old men write PHP. So Node, for example, is very popular, and it's very good at aggregating a lot of data because you can send a lot of HTTP requests, and they don't stop the application flow. Instead, they kind of get back as they do. This is why a lot of large companies also are using Node to act as a front end for their, big, important business critical applications. And this is something that you might as well do together with Easy. If you have a lot of different flows that are coming from maybe various Easy backends or something, you might want to use that. And obviously then the SDK opens up a whole new market possibly for Easy developer or Easy in general or Easy developers, because you don't need to even be able to install Easy. As long as you have an Easy instance running somewhere, you use the API to interact it with purely in JavaScript. You don't even ever log into a server and then clear caches or whatever. So this is one thing that could be interesting as well. And for example, for React doesn't need to be complex. You can use it just for bits and pieces, like let's say a loan calculator on a bank website. It doesn't need to actually, you don't need to do like a whole thing with it, like a whole world encompassing rich application. It can be just a snippet of, a functional piece. And then obviously there's some things that you should take note. So currently there's some improvements that or work that needs to be done to make the client API installable with NPM, which is the composer equivalent of Node. So it would be easier to use with some of the techniques. So then there's also some improvements probably to the syntax to make it use promises instead of callbacks and this kind of things. Documentation exists, the client API documentation, but there could be more documentation. And also if you plan to use the Easy REST API, as you've noticed that it is very granular and very general purpose. So if you, for example, if you make a mobile application, for each individual page load, you might end up getting 5 or 10 separate API calls. There was now discussion that there will be the aggregation, so that number will can go down, but it's still maybe not the ideal API, REST API for all custom things. And still the React ecosystem can be quite overwhelming, so start quite simple with it. The React site itself is probably a really good place to start. They start in a smart way. Then we'll jump to the demo. Hopefully we'll get something working. Just a few notes about it. So it's a simple app, just a to-do app. We use quite modern JavaScript syntax. So what you see is JavaScript, is not something that's compiled. The JSX syntax, which is this kind of mixed JavaScript and HTML thingy. It looks weird in the beginning, but it's essentially like inline PHP. If you think about it, you enter JavaScript with these curly braces. Once we'll go there, and then work with PHP or work with JavaScript. Then a few words about props and state. These are two terms that you will get a lot when you work with React, because people will talk about properties and states. And for how I would sort of put it is that properties are, in case of easy client API and the React, I would say that their properties are for query parameters. So when you do things like location ID, language ID, object type, these are kind of properties that you send somewhere, which will then result in the state, which is domain objects, so content objects, location, and so on. Because this, let's see, because it's very close to, conceptually, it's now together working. It's very close to working with the PHP API in general. So maybe first I'll dig a little into the application itself. As you can see, it's not very complex. I'll put this one here. So it's just a to-do app, and it's a very simplistic to-do app. Let's say Oslo. Then you can see it stores, you can't even delete anything. But the key here is that this data, where the backend is actually the easy content repository that we have running here. We have one hello here, but we should have the second hello again once it's around. So that's pretty much like the functionality of the application is that, and it's limited by scope intentionally to fit it into the demo. But you can see now we have Oslo object here. I could even edit the Oslo object from here. We're actually using the exact same API. Let's publish that. And then obviously this won't magically auto-load because I don't have any auto-loading mechanisms, but you can see that it's the same data. But then before we dive into the code, I think we should take a look at the application structure. One of the good things about React is the development tools are pretty good. So any site, Facebook or anything, you can go to the React site which uses React, and then if you download the React developer tools, you can actually pretty well examine the front-end application from outside. And as I said about the tree, you can see that obviously it's HTML, so it looks like a tree, but the application itself is already structured in a tree. So at the root level of our application, don't mind the tags are what they are. You can see that we have the to-dos application. This could be, let's say, media node and content node, users node, whatever. You don't have to have just one. You can have multiple on one page and so on, and so on. Then for the properties, in this example case, I wanted to make the component, which is then reusable, to be a little bit flexible. So the component is essentially a tag, which I can then pass parameters into. In this case, I added some simple ones, such as the title. If I change the title property here, I'd say don't do, yeah, it changes the text, but anyway, you can see that this is a property which I pass here. Then I have the other properties which are very similar from Easy. So content class ID, language ID, and root path. These are the ones I set on the root level of the application. For the application itself, this is dynamically created, so the root or the actual HTML does not contain this structure. This structure is created by React. But then from here, within our to-dos, we have the main level, which just has the H1. Then we have something called to-do items, which is again a tree structure. They're embedded. And inside here we have a few nodes, which we'll go and see how those are then composed later. And another component, because maybe when you start working with React, you should kind of decide on the structure of the application before just starting to code. Because in this case, obviously it's quite fast to decide that, okay, these are the ones I want. But in this case, we technically have just the main node, which has the items and then a form. The form obviously then has a button and something. And for still returning a little bit to the properties and state, for me, working with Easy, it's easy to see that the properties, which are here, contain the variables that I have set, but the state itself, it's loaded. In this case, I load it from the backend, but this can be any kind of a number of different tools. But the state itself contains the to-dos, and the state can change even while I upload, but you shouldn't usually modify the properties as I manually did here. But this is pretty much the functionality, obviously, of the application. Then the state of the whole application, because the application root is here. If I add another one, let's say, please work, well, then it obviously won't work. Well, it did. Yeah, but anyway, then you can see that I added work here, and it's added to the state. This is quite simple, but the idea is that you don't worry about how the state is managed or whether I need to add a new list item. You simply let React take care of this part. So this is mostly now about the UI. As for the network, for example, if you think about it, adding a new element in React or in Easy requires quite a few things. You need to create a location, you need to create the object itself, and then after that you need to publish it. So there's quite a lot of few things. So we should quickly see what goes on in the background. So for adding a new item, we get one call, another call, and a third call. So we get a number of calls, but as you'll see now, when we jump into the code, we didn't actually define any of the HTTP calls, what goes in, sort of, which you usually work when you work with REST APIs. You kind of look into what exactly are the headers, what content type did I want, what do I accept, and so on. So these are, again, the kind of abstractions that the client API provides you, whereas opposed to what React was then doing on the state and UI level. You will, of course, have access to the code. But if we quickly jump through it, so now you have the mental idea of what we have. We have just a few nodes of UI and so on. The bare bones, the bootstrap for the application is quite simple. We have the React.js library itself, then the DOM, because React can actually target other targets as a browser. Then you have something that allows you to use good JavaScript instead of bad JavaScript. Then we have actually included the JavaScript API itself. So this one will handle the complexities for communicating with Easy. Then we need to have a root node for our applications, which in this case we just have an empty div called ID to-dos. And then we bootstrap our app.js application here, which obviously is where most of the application logic is based in. And then the starting point for application is at the bottom. So as discussed, always in React, you have components. You have components, and then you try to find the plus button. Why is this not working? I just change it the other way. Well, what? Well, I don't know. Maybe my browser is automatically, or editor goes automatically to Norwegian keyboard or something. But now we got it back to reasonable. Okay, I won't touch it anymore. Anyway, here we have the root node of our application. Nothing defines except us that what we work with. The strange syntax, which often is here, this is the JSX syntax, which gets converted to real JavaScript. So you kind of write JavaScript and then you write HTML in between. But you can actually escape back to JavaScript, as we'll see soon. But here you see that we send the properties, we send the to-dos as a title, then we send the content class ID, root path, and so on. This makes our component somewhat configurable. So instead of having don't do tag, we would just have a to-do tag with different title and different content IDs and so on. From here, our application starts searching for a to-do tag or to-do component actually. The to-do component is the root component of our whole application. In this case, it contains majority of the actual logic related to our functionality. And right at the top, we jump to the constructor section. So this is a class that extends the React component. So for some reason, you need to call the parent with the constructor parameters. But then we set the initial state. When you load it, we set it to null because we don't know it yet because we haven't loaded anything. Then in this case, we'll use a really raw method and just set the credentials to be login and password, which is obviously not production good, but it's good for demo. Then the client API, which we need to initialize. For this to initialize, we need to define the backend. The backend, I guess, could also be remote if the remote server is configured to allow connections from external sources. But in this case, it's just our local. And then we log in. And now after this, we have the client API is logged into Easy. And from there on, once we have this, we can get the content service. Again, now it becomes familiar that you're working with Easy. In this case, it happens to be JavaScript. But we set the content service to be available in this to-do instance. And the content service will allow you to do a lot of same kind of things that you would normally work with Easy things. And sorry, actually here is where we perform the login, not here. So here we will try to log in. This is just that we get error message if it fails, and the response if it doesn't fail. And here we have simple error handling. So if it's an error, we just log that login failed. So if we change something here, it won't be able to log in. But in this case, we'll just jump right through to the assumption that we are able to log in as we were. in this case, we'll load state from easy. So this is just a method that we've written, or I've written. Here we simply go to a method which says that load state from easy. The query is something, it's a new view create struct. Then we define it to be a content query. In Easy API, you have both location queries and content queries, but it will do a content query. And then, very similar to the working with the API, you need to define criterions or criteria. These are actually not in the application itself, but they're actually handled on the server side. So you can technically, I guess, extend these, but that's something which I won't even try to touch today. But in this case, we'll just define that we want to find items of the type to do. And then, similar to other queries, we'll put the view input and set the limit to 100. So that's something. Obviously, the risk with working with this is that if the backend boggles down with 100,000 requests, there's nobody stopping you from modifying the client side and making 100,000 calls. And if that bogs down the server, well, that's how it is, unless you add some verification to the server side. But then we get the content service. We call the create view. So we get the query, which we built, just like using PHP. Then same pattern, error first, response then. Error being just a Boolean, I guess. I think it's just Boolean. And then response being whatever is returned. Again, we'll just assume that our query was kosher with the demo and not go with the error handling. But then here we go with the state, because the component's state was initially set to be empty, but we'll set the to-do value to be the response, but we need to simplify it a bit because the REST API gives you a lot of information. It gives you information about the versions and so on, and we don't need all of that for our simple to-do list. So this is just a helper method that we've added. This helper method simply gets the response, then it pulls out the search hits, it creates an empty to-do array, it loops through the hits, and then it creates simple objects with just the ID and just the text. As you can see, the text can be a bit hard to get, or it's like a long list, so there's some maybe developer experience improvements could be done. But then we simply return the to-dos, a simplified version of the to-dos, back to the state. And here, then the state is something that React also manages. So for this component, we have the state. Now the state is set to something. If the state changes from the previous state, React will actually render the list. We don't need to explicitly, after changing the state, need to add an item to the list or verify that it's there. We just set the state and React will update the UI for us. So that's, again, some of the things that you could do manually, but it's nicer to have this kind of thing from here. So this was the initial call because we don't have any update pattern or anything. And for the markup of the element itself, you can see the familiar JSX syntax. The properties, this is just JavaScript. So once we add the curly brace, we escape to JavaScript, similar to PHP open tag. We get this props title. This was just the attribute that we relayed before. The to-do items, which is the list of items that are in the current state, are handled next. It is another component. So just like the root component was a component, each component underneath is equal. So you make the kind of hierarchy of, or design the hierarchy. So essentially the to-do item is just as good as like the whole to-do app. But here, for example, to simplify, we get the to-do, pass the to-do items, we pass the state, because the state is now in the parent, so we pass it down to the to-do items list. Then this will just map and loop through all the to-do items. it will put the key as an ID and then put the text here, and then it will return again a single node. In this case, it's a UL node with more LIs here, but we don't ever need to worry about executing this. We just need to worry about setting the state, and then React will automatically execute and render the view to whatever we want. So this is so far that has happened here. So we as you can see, the server-side rendering is an advantage when you want to provide flicker-free experience, because there's a delay now that I was working. It's first simple, the state is first blank, then it connects to easy, and then it bootstraps and things like that. But here, we didn't ever once define any React or any HTTP calls or add any DOM nodes. That's the kind of abstractions we have here working together. And obviously then to still add to it, so we have the add button. The add button is again, or the add form, it's again another component here. It's just a component, and then we pass some things. Usually you would probably use some kind of a state management library to manage the state properly, but in this case I will just pass these services down. It's probably not ideal, but it worked for the demo. But I also pass the content class ID, root path, and other things down to it, so that then the form itself will have access to those which are passed in again from the top. And from here, obviously there's the form itself is quite simple. The form, and then it has an on-submit event, as you might expect. There is some sort of magical properties in JSX, so on-submit will handle the click and so on. Then the actual input field, which contains the item, is again, it's a state of this current form object. So the form object simply has one field, so the text for the new to-do is something. And this is done using an on-change event. So when this component is changed, then it's changed the state of this current component and so on. So it's something that once you get maybe working with it, it feels quite predictable at least. And then the value of this is actually always simply the state of the current component. Again, we don't separately empty the field itself or touch the field's value attribute. We simply set this component state to be something, and then React will reflect it to be in the HTML as we would expect. But then let's hop back to the on-submit event. So obviously we add something. We will click the submit, and then because this is just normal JavaScript, it's a form, you're submitting a form. First you need to prevent the bubbling so it doesn't actually try to submit the form normally. But then this is where things are quite familiar again with the easy API. So you create a new location struct. For this location struct, I guess for API versioning reasons, you need to pass the whole path of this, but at the end, what we want to have here is /1/2 in our case, but we get it from the properties, which we can configure simply from the very outside, and so on. But this is technically just the location where we want our object to be published in the easy content tree. Then we create a content create struct, because you need an object needs a location. And here we add the content type. So content type it's just an ID. So it was 21 maybe, but if we change it to be something else, then it's something else. Location struct is the location that we created here, and then the properties, which is language. So you're working with the easy content model, so you need the content type, where it's going to be where it should be published or stored, and then you need also the language. and then obviously need to add values to the fields or the field values. For complex data types, I don't know how they work currently, but for example, if I want to upload or create an image, I don't currently even know how that would be done. But for this case, we just have a text field, and whose name is text, and I simply set the state of the form's text field to be that. And after that, good, we've initialized our location, the content is all good to go. So then we need to create content. We'll create the content create struct. And again, familiar error response. If error, then I will just log unable to create content. Your UI might be more user-friendly, but okay. If it did go forward and the content was created, for me it wasn't initially visible, which I thought there's a bug or I didn't know, but obviously I didn't publish it. It didn't get published automatically. So then from the created object, which is returned to me, I get the ID, and then I call the content service, and I call the publish version method, which then in turn I simply add the created object ID, which I cannot know in the state because it comes from the server, because the server knows what the ID is, the application doesn't. And then I just hard code that I will publish version 1 because that's the version what we just created. And then from here on, we will, in our case, because our state is managed in a suboptimal way, I will just pass that state up to the parent component. But there's a lot of options for that. And to actually make it apparent to the user, okay, maybe something more positive. So just to give the application a more feel that it works, I created 2 of those. I just reset the value here to be nothing. And then this is not done by changing the HTML DOM value. This is done by setting the state of this component, the form component, to nothing. And then that in turn is reflected to the UI, but I don't have to explicitly say that this should be done after this, because these are the kind of bugs that easily bite you if you work with jQuery or something, that you simply forget to reset a value, and then in complex applications it can be head to something which the customer maybe continuously complains about, that why does this always happen, when it's up to the developer maybe to remember certain things. But in any case, in our case, so the state management is done so that I simply say that the value has changed for this child component, and it bubbles in this case from here that the state or the value has changed, and I don't set the value from the child to the parent. Yeah, but I will do so that I say that the state changed, and then this one will trigger a call to the same method that we did initially. So we don't duplicate code for getting the content, because obviously we get it for the second time when we're doing the call for the updated list. And then we had running low on time, but the source code obviously is available. From this office you will find, if nothing else, you can come to this office and find out tomorrow, but also online, Twitter or something. Then just maybe final, because the React or the client API are not the only options that you would use. You could use, there are many options that you could use. Angular 2 is very similar. Vue.js is very similar to React, not maybe syntax-wise, but conceptually. All of them have this tree-like structure. This is what everybody realized now, that it's good. At some point, all the CMSs will also understand that it's good to have a tree structure. But in any case, there's plenty of good things out there. And for the client API, you might want to also maybe create another kind of backend API, which might be suited better for public-facing applications. But for creation, content creation, probably the REST API in Easy is probably really, really good as well. We were running low on time, but I think if anybody has any questions, we can continue the discussion also after the event. But thank you, and hopefully you have not a complete understanding, because I don't have a complete understanding, but you have an idea of the possibilities that maybe React and the client API could offer you, and maybe sort of if you haven't worked with the front-end technologies in a while, it's moved forward quite a bit in a number of ways. Good, but we'll call it a night for now. So thank you for your attention, and this should be the final thing, or did we have anything else? Good. Anyway, we'll stop right now, so thank you for attending. Bye.